Hi, welcome to the Taste of the New South Wales Forum webinar. So our host today will be myself. I'm the New South Wales chapter lead for the RBMS. We've also got Brad and Jess helping in the background. This is our amazing committee over to the side there. So first of all, I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge I'm hosting this webinar from the land of the Wadi Wadi people who are part of the Dharawal Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all reside today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and I respect the continuing deep spiritual connection that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have to country and their unique ability to care for country. So who's RBMS? We're a diverse community of practice in Australia, and we're a dedicated group of people who are really keen to talk and network and discuss new and innovative techniques for managing our rivers and catchments. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the New South Wales Forum. At the start of the year, we had a forum in Armidale, and we had about 60 participants attend. And the whole aim of that forum was to get practitioners, researchers, and the community together to talk about rivers in northern New South Wales. So it was a really successful event. And so we thought, why not bring the rest of Australia the opportunity to hear from 3 of our amazing speakers? So I'd like to thank the organising committee of that event, as well as our sponsors, which were Two Rod Consulting, University of New England, Northern Tablelands Local Land Services, and New South Wales Deep Wire Fisheries. So today we have our guest speakers will be Louise Streeting from University of New England, Jenny Wingo from Local Land Services, and Rebecca Mabbott from Macquarie University. So first of all, I will pass over to Louise, who will talk to you about the reproductive and conservation ecology of the Bell's turtle. Over to you, Louise.
Hi, everyone. Oops. Hang on, I've just lost my presentation. I'll try again. Can you all see that? Is that working? Yep.
Yeah, we're good to go. Thanks, Louise.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. As Rhiannon said, my name is Lou Streeting. I'm a PhD student at the University of New England. And my research project is on the reproductive and conservation ecology of the endangered Bell's turtle. So despite decades of conservation efforts, turtle populations are still declining worldwide. Of the 356 turtle species, 61% are threatened or have recently become extinct. It's widely recognised that turtles are particularly vulnerable to predation during early life stages, which includes when they're eggs in the nest and small juveniles and hatchlings. Nest depredation is particularly bad when predators are invasive and the turtle species have not co-evolved with that predator. This is a beautiful big female Bell's turtle. Bell's turtles are primarily aquatic. They do not migrate over land, so they're not the turtle that you see crossing the road. They're not the more common eastern long-necked turtle. Bell's turtles are endemic to the high altitude western flowing rivers of the New England tablelands. They're a long-lived species. We know they live for at least 40 years, but we suspect that they live quite a lot longer, possibly beyond 100 years of age. The females grow bigger than the males. This big female, her shell length is about 30 centimetres and she weighs about 3 kilos. Bell's turtles are a late maturing species and the females don't start laying eggs until they're 20 years of age. And once they're mature, the female will lay a single clutch of up to 30 eggs in the riverbank, and they'll lay a single clutch of eggs each breeding season, and those eggs have to stay in the riverbank for up to 90 days. Whilst we still have a lot of adult Bell's turtles in our waterways, the population is ageing and there's very little to no juvenile recruitment, which makes the population vulnerable to a sudden crash in the near future. And unfortunately, in some areas, we think that juvenile recruitment has all but stopped, with juveniles making up less than 1% of some of those populations. Over the last 3 breeding seasons, I've found that more than 95% of Bell's turtle nests are raided by foxes. And often this is within 24 to 48 hours of the eggs being laid. This slide shows a fox sniffing around a Bell's turtle nesting bank, and it also shows a raided Bell's turtle nest. You can see the fox has dug the eggs out of the ground and the shell fragments are scattered around. And if you look really closely, there is a fox scat inside that nest chamber. This time-lapse footage taken at one of my study sites shows a fox raiding 3 Bell's turtle nests in the one night. There are some camera traps set up there and they're actually looking at protected nests, but this fox has come in and raided another 3 nests before I could find them, before I knew they were there. Unfortunately, I've also found that foxes are taking female turtles when they come up onto the riverbank to nest. I've found Bell's turtle carcasses scattered around active fox dens. So my project is looking at the reproductive ecology of Bell's turtles and evaluating conservation strategies that aim to protect against fox predation or bypass fox predation, and also aiming to increase the number of juveniles in the populations in the wild. There have been no published studies on the nesting ecology of Bell's turtles, and up until the start of my research project, there had been no Bell's turtle nests, live turtle nests reported. So my project's looking at in situ nest protection and ex situ rearing of hatchlings to aid in the recovery of this turtle species. This time-lapse footage, again at one of my study sites, shows female Bell's turtles coming up onto the riverbank to nest during an afternoon storm in November. You can see at one stage there's 4 females nesting on the bank at the one time, and if you look closely you can also see other turtles and little turtle noses in the river, so other turtles scoping out that nesting bank. Oh, I'll just show you there, that's a still photo just pointing out those 4 females nesting all together. So the first conservation strategy I'm looking at is protecting nests in the wild. So I cover the nests with wire mesh or a steel cage if there is stock in the area. I just peg the wire into the ground and that wire stays on top of the nest for the next 80 to 90 days. Finding nests can be really difficult. Sometimes you can see turtle tracks coming up out of the river and up the bank. And sometimes you can see a turtle-shaped imprint in a substrate, which indicates that a turtle female has nested there. These signs they're not always there, and sometimes they don't last very long. I'll just show you there. There's the tracks, and there's that imprint. So because these tracks and traces are hard to find or non-existent, I'm working with camera traps to try and locate nests, but I'm also working with a detection dog team from Canines for Wildlife who have specifically trained 2 detection dogs to find specifically Bell's turtle nests. This is Max and Bunya. They're English Springer Spaniels, and they are just fantastic. In the first season, they had a really hard time finding nests because they had no material to work with, but they're just going ahead in leaps and bounds now and getting really good at finding Bell's turtle nests for us, and they seem to really enjoy it. And when they find a nest, they're rewarded with by their trainers with a ball game, and they love it. This is the typical nesting habitat that Bell's turtles seem to prefer. It's bare and exposed. It's got little to no overhead vegetation or shade. It's quite often a cattle access way where cattle get down to access the river. The soil types vary from sandy loam or rocky gravel to hard setting clay soils. And I have found though that hatching success is highest in sandy loam soil. This is another photo of one of my nesting banks. It's a panoramic photo, so the photo is taken from the water's edge looking up the bank. You can see that I've got camera traps set up there. They're all looking at protected nests. I protected 14 nests on this bank last season. The photo was taken late in the season as hatchlings were starting to emerge from the nests. So I've got a pitfall trap and a drift fence set up there so I can intercept hatchlings and mark them before they go back into the river. Although turtles, the Bell's turtles will nest all over the bank, they tend to nest more frequently at the base of a step in the bank. This footage shows a fox trying to get into one of my protected nests. She spends 20 minutes here before she finally gives up and moves on. So as I said, this mesh is only pegged into the ground, but so far it has prevented any predation of any of the protected nests. You can see she's having a good go at it there. This is actually that same nest later on in the season, and over on the left-hand side you can see wild Bell's turtle hatchlings emerging from their underground nest. So after they've incubated in the bank for 90 days, they dig their way out. They're only the size of a 10 or a 20 cent piece, so they have no trouble getting out from under that nest and scrambling down the bank to the river. So here's a quick summary of my nest protection results so far. Over 3 seasons, I've been surveying a 2-kilometre stretch of river, and I've found 134 nests. 50% of had fox and chamber near the nest. I've only been able to find 7 nests in total that made it through to hatching successfully without any protection. And then I've protected 50 live nests, and from those live nests I know that 700 hatchlings have made it back into the rivers. So I now have 3 seasons of data on timing and location of nesting, incubation duration, nest chamber temperature and humidity. Something that was dramatically different over those 3 seasons is hatching success. In the first season, the average temperature in the nest was 25 degrees and hatching success was 90%. However, in the second season, the temperature in the nest chamber went up 3 degrees. The average was closer to 29 degrees and hatching success dropped to less than 70%. So that season, a lot of hatchlings perished and I think they couldn't get out of the nest because the soil was so hard and dry, they just couldn't dig their way out. And I also found that with some of the hatchlings, their yolk sac had actually, it looked as though it had cooked. Then we had last season, 2019-2020, which began in drought. And with the lower river levels, the turtles still nested within about 6 metres of the riverbank. And then when we did have rain in January, all of the nests that I protected were inundated by river water. And the hatching success, I'm still analysing the results, but it looks like it's dropped to less than 50% for last season. I did move a nest that was in the path of impending floodwater. I moved it 2 metres up the bank, up to the top of the bank actually, just to try and give it a chance of survival. And it wasn't inundated, but for a short period of time, and all of the eggs in that nest hatched successfully, so that was good. So the second strategy I'm looking at is the rearing of hatchlings in the laboratory. So over 2 seasons, I've used oxytocin to induce 29 wild-caught females to lay eggs, and I've incubated those eggs across 3 temperatures, 27, 28 and 29 degrees. And I've released 400 hatchlings that were reared in the laboratory. I found that eggs incubated at higher temperatures have a shorter incubation period, and eggs incubated at 27 had a higher hatching success. So in the second season, I incubated all eggs at 27 degrees and got a 97% hatching success rate. 2 hatchlings that were released in the first season were found again 300 days later. This is one of those hatchlings. On the left, you can see how big the hatchling was upon release. And then on the right of the screen, you can see how much it's grown 300 days later, and it basically doubled in size and weight. I have retained 50 hatchlings and I've kept them for 12 months to get them to a larger, more predator-resistant size. The plan was to fit them with radio trackers so that I could track movement, growth, survival and habitat use. But unfortunately, due to COVID restrictions on fieldwork, I had to let them go in March without any trackers. I will be doing intensive juvenile surveys starting in spring. So I'm hoping to recapture some of those 12-month-olds and then fit them with trackers. So I'm evaluating the effectiveness of these two conservation strategies and looking at the survival rates of the hatchlings from the lab and from protected nests. And I'm cautiously anticipating an increase in the number of juveniles in the wild populations over coming seasons. So for this freshwater turtle species, it's pretty obvious that current fox control measures are inadequate, and without conservation intervention, this species will likely become extinct. So some of my research findings are already being implemented. This spring, a team of ecologists, landowners and Aboriginal rangers will be locating and protecting wild Bell's turtle nests, and there will be a hatchling release program starting this season, which will be aiming to hatch and release 1,000 hatchlings each season. And this coming season, I'll be looking at adult Bell's turtle movement and habitat use using acoustic tags and underwater hydrophones, and I'll be using similar methods to those used by Mariana Michelli-Campbell et al. 2017. I'll also be working with ecologists Bruce Chessman, Phil Spark and Darren Fielder to revise the growth model and longevity estimate for Bell's turtles. Analysis for this will be done using the carapace length of recaptured animals. Current estimates for this species are based on a reasonably small sample size, but the revised analysis will be done using more than 500 recaptures now, which spans 21 years. So in any conservation program, it's important to inform and involve the community, and the hatchling release programs have been an awesome opportunity to involve local school kids. So far, kids from Bendemeer, Katingal and Kingstown schools have been able to release hatchlings in their local rivers, and along the way they've learnt about the importance of looking after our river environment and about looking after our animal species. So my program is, my research project is funded by New South Wales Environmental Trust and is coordinated by Local Land Services in collaboration with the University of New England. I'm really excited about my project, and it's really good to know that some of my research is actually being used to help guide conservation actions for this endangered turtle species. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Louise. We've just got a question here, and I forgot to mention early on that if you'd like to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A section and I will read it out. The questions that aren't read out, we'll ask the presenters to respond, and we'll send that at the end of the webinar throughout the week. So we've got a question here from Ewan Belson. You mentioned conservation intervention. Given a major threat is fox predation, what would you have in mind on a landscape scale for conservation intervention? How would you measure its success?
Well, my measure of success is to see juveniles in the population. So actually see an increase in the number of juveniles in the population. Fox control is a tricky one. It seems that as you take foxes out, more foxes come in from somewhere else, and foxes pass along the knowledge on how to find Bell's turtle nests, it seems. And yeah, basically, if you see an increase in the number of juveniles and those juveniles are making it through to reproducing, then there's success. So by actually bypassing that threat in the first place, the foxes, I think we're giving the turtle a fair chance of making it through to maturing and reproducing.
Thanks, Lou. We've also got one more question from Alice Chapman. She said, the turtles are so cute and thanks for the hard work. My question is, have you found frost control in the areas around your nest to impact turtle hatchling success?
I haven't been involved in controlling the number of foxes. I know that local land services do have fox control initiatives underway. However, there is another PhD student at the University of New England who is working on the impact of fox control. But basically, with Bell's turtles, I think the amount of predation is just going to wipe this turtle out before, if we don't do something about it. Fox control is not adequate at the moment. Yeah, so unless something drastic happens with fox control, this turtle will go extinct before. Yeah, we can't really wait.
Okay, thanks Lou and Alice for that question. We've got one here from Fergus Hancock. You mentioned bare riverbanks without overhanging vegetation. Densely vegetated banks are preferred biohabitat. What do we know of in-channel habitat needs for this species and remediation efforts to provide them?
It's a tricky one because usually as environmentalists, we're pushing for vegetated banks. We want vegetation to hold banks together and keep them from washing away. So this tricky turtle decides it likes bare areas. However, I think we don't have to have a completely bare area for this turtle. This turtle just requires small cleared areas. Yeah, so vegetation is fine, just a few bare spots, sandy banks and things seem to go well for the turtle. So if we can just stop fox predation, I think that we can get away with nicely vegetated rivers and streams. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Lou.
Sorry, I was just going to say with cattle, so there is an initiative by local land services to try and get people to temporarily fence off river nesting areas. So we don't want people to keep cattle out of those areas all the time. We just want them to fence the areas off during nesting seasons. So then the cattle does keep the vegetation down a little bit and the turtle will come in and nest.
Thanks for that, Lou. So if your question doesn't get answered, we'll look to answer it afterwards. So now we'll move over to Jenny, and she's going to talk about a project from the Hunter Estuary. Thanks, Jenny.
Hey, thanks, Ree.
Share your screen.
And thanks for your presentation, Lou. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to give this a go. Has the right screen popped up, Ree?
Yep.
Yeah, great.
Good.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for inviting me to talk at the webinar. I'm Jenny. I've been working at Hunter Local Land Services for about the last 8 years in the Hunter River and Estuary, and prior to that worked at Fisheries working on habitat rehabilitation projects in rivers in both the inland and the coast. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Worimi and Awabakal peoples as the traditional custodians of the land through which the Lower Hunter River flows and where we've completed our project, and also extend my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Today I'm going to be presenting a case study of the use of timber and revegetation to promote riverbank stability in the Hunter Estuary. After a couple of introductory slides, I'll be showing a 5-minute video and a few more slides after that. So I hope if we have any Victorians in the crowd who are stuck down in lockdown, maybe it's a bit of a respite, taking a little tour of the mighty Hunter River. And I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues, Guy Lampert and Dan Love, and their team from Soil Conservation Service who are involved in delivering this project. Sorry, my screen seems to have paused for a sec. There we go. Yeah, okay. So our site's on the Hunter Estuary, approximately 30 kilometres upstream of Newcastle, the New South Wales coast. The red star indicates the location of our project site. So by way of background, the Hunter Estuary has more than 200 kilometres of riverbanks within the tidally influenced section of the river. And a range of impacts lead to poor bank condition, like historic clearing of riparian vegetation, unrestricted stock access, wind and boat waves, and these have all led to a reduced resilience in the riverbank to be able to withstand the daily forces and floods. So this photo on the left there, typical bank condition in the lower Hunter, it's really struggling, unrestricted cattle access and some ongoing erosion issues. We also have a large-scale flood mitigation scheme constructed after the floods in the 1940s and 50s. And the scheme includes floodgates and levees, which line the riverbanks and sort of impact our ability to rehabilitate riparian areas with vegetation. There's sometimes just not enough space between the river and the levee. So Soil Conservation Service conducted a review of bank stability risks in the Hunter Valley Flood Mitigation Scheme infrastructure in 2018, and their study showed us that 30% of riverbanks of the total 210 kilometres assessed showed signs of instability and ongoing bank retreat. So we've had the opportunity to work on a site at Miller's Forest, which has active bank erosion, and importantly, a landholder who is also willing to change his farming methods. So in the photo there, again on the left, taken at low tide in 2017, you can see vertical, sometimes undercut banks with an intertidal bench suited to the techniques of erosion control to promote the natural regeneration of mangroves. So when this landholder first approached us, he noticed mangroves were trying to take root, but they'd be washed away before they managed to establish. So it's tidal here, and a tidal range of about 1.5 metres. The bench you can see below the sheer bank, it goes underwater at high tide. So our project goals were to manage the erosion, which was leading to agricultural land loss and of course water quality impacts. We want to promote revegetation, so the deep-rooted native plants to provide the long-term stability and improve riverine environmental outcomes. It's well known that native fish use timber as in-stream habitat, and timber provides the building blocks for the aquatic food web. And I feel like I might be talking to a well and truly converted crowd here with RBMS, who I'm sure you all appreciate the value of timber in Australian rivers. We wanted to develop a new method and provide a working example of the use of timber in an estuarine environment. As I mentioned, in the Hunter River, it had been very rock focused up until now. That's not true. There were some other small projects, but we're just looking at doing it slightly differently. We wanted to compare costs of works with other traditional methods, and I'll briefly talk about a couple of those now. So rock revetment, it was the go-to option for bank stabilisation in past government-funded river management programs in the Hunter. The primary goal was to protect assets, some of which may or may not be well situated adjacent to dynamic riverbanks, but no doubt rock revetment does stop erosion. However, the Hunter Estuary now has 76 kilometres of the stuff. It's a high cost, so current value, you know, $1,000 to $2,000 per lineal metre, and also some unintended impacts like effectively channelizing the river in places, defecting flows, and inhibiting vegetation growth. So we acknowledge that rock revetment may still be necessary where it protects high value assets like levees, and it may be a public expectation for high use waterfronts areas like recreational parks. But unfortunately, it's now also an expectation of some landholders in the Hunter who are maybe a bit more unwilling to change their land management practices because they think the government will just come and fix it if it gets too bad. And then rock fillets, for those of you unfamiliar, they're rock walls placed offset to the bank up to the mean high watermark level and suitable for tidal areas. They provide small protected embayments for mangroves and reeds to establish. And in the last 10 years, rock fillets have been installed at least 3 locations in the Hunter Estuary and also in many other New South Wales estuaries. They've proven successful in at least 2 Hunter sites, as reported by Mick Taylor, who presented his results in the Coastal Conference in 2017. And then there's also examples of rock fillets, sort of hybrid rock fillets that incorporate timber root balls on the North Coast estuaries. And that was again presented at the 2017 Coastal Conference by John Smith. So if you're interested in learning more about rock fillets, there's some papers on the New South Wales Coastal Conference site. So that brings me to our project using timber logs and revegetation to improve the bank stability. We wanted to take the principles of rock fillets and use timber instead of rock. We had a local source of hardwood timber from approved clearing, from road developments, housing subdivisions, and pivot irrigation systems. We developed a methodology based on characteristics of the site, which has an intertidal bench, as I've mentioned. And the project sought to promote revegetation as the ultimate goal for bank stability. So I'll put the video on now. Hopefully it plays. Rhiannon, shout out if it doesn't start playing, please. Clicking,
not
clicking,
playing for us
clicking.
yet.
Yeah, it's not quite happening, is it? Oh, that's a bummer. Hope you don't mind if I just jump out of the screen sharing mode.
Go for it.
Dang, it can't play it. I have a backup plan. Just bear with me for a sec. Apologies, everyone.
I guess while people are waiting, if they can think of any questions that they'd like to ask, or if you have any other questions for Lou. Actually, we had one question here, Lou, that I could ask you. I'll ask you in between. So, are your findings influencing riparian revegetation activities in known turtle breeding areas, given your knowledge of the types of habitat that they like to inhabit?
I'm a bit reluctant to influence the revegetation methods because, as you saw, the banks were pretty eroded and pugged and bare, basically. Quite horrendous conditions, some of them. Yeah, so no, aside from local land services fencing off some areas, and they do have revegetation programs as well, no, the turtle project so far hasn't influenced revegetation. But I would hate to see revegetation stuff stop. I'd just like to see it incorporate a couple of their areas for turtles, but yeah, I'd still like to see the banks remain intact.
Thanks, Lou.
All right. Sorry, should I put it
Jenny?
on now? Sorry.
Yep, we just heard it.
This site's on the Hunter River estuary, so we're just downstream of where the Williams River joins the Hunter River around Raymond Terrace. And the property owner here, Andrew Redriff, contacted us in the early days of our project to gain advice on how he could manage his riverbanks and prevent erosion continuing. I asked experts from Soil Conservation Service to visit the site to give an opinion on erosion control methods that might be suitable for this site.
One of the requirements that local land services had for this project was to trial new or different materials to deliver the desired outcome.
And I wanted to try something a bit more environmentally sensitive than rock revetment.
The issue with rock revetment is that it doesn't offer that sheltered environment which will help the mangroves establish. One of the challenges that this site experiences that is different to other sites, it's tidal here, and so we get water moving in both an upstream and downstream direction. So the design of the structure has to accommodate for that so that we can protect the riverbank from tidal currents. But also in this environment, we're dealing with large bodies of water where wind speeds can generate quite significant wave heights on the riverbank as well. So we have to be able to protect the riverbank from wind waves coming from a wide variety of angles. So what we came up with was to trial this log wall structure where we use reclaimed timber from approved clearing and recover that material and put it on the riverbank to protect it from further erosion. That helps to reduce the wave energy that's impacting the riverbank and provide a sheltered environment behind the log wall that will facilitate the recruitment of mangrove and salt marsh species, but primarily mangroves that will help with their roots to hold the riverbank together.
The timber is expected to stay in place while the mangroves and trees establish, and in the long run provide a stable, healthy riverbank.
In order to build the wall, first we have to find a supply of logs. We have those logs delivered to site. Using a 27-tonne excavator, we then can place those logs on the riverbank. The way we do that, the excavator has a grab bucket attachment. We then place footer logs parallel to the riverbank but offset from the riverbank. After that, we use 5-metre timber pins driven into the mud in pairs at each end of the footer logs, and we then drill and thread through galvanised round bar that is twisted around each of the pins and wound around itself, so that then secures all of the footer logs and the top logs in position. The top logs are generally placed in a crisscross fashion to not only break up the wave energy, but to build it up to the required height that we need to protect the riverbank. So we need to get above the high water mark of the river. So far we've completed 3 stages of this project. We were here completing stage 2 this time last year. So in the 12 months since, we have seen a significant recruitment and growth of mangroves from last season's seed drop.
So we found this technique using timber logs has been really successful at this site. It helps to trap mangrove seeds. It also helps prevent some of the eroding bank from washing out into the river, so improved water quality results. This method also uses a source of materials that would otherwise be burnt or wood chipped, so it's a good cheap source of materials. And the fact we're planting and fencing behind the riverbank makes it a more holistic project. So we found the use of timber in bank stabilisation to be quite a cost-effective method and showing great signs of success at this site. We're hoping that more and more often there'll be alternative riverbank management techniques trialled and put into place, and in the end it'll lead to healthier rivers in New South Wales.
It's been a pleasure to be involved with this project and try a new technique that is innovative and something that potentially could pave the way for a new technique that can be adopted right across the state.
Okay, thanks for watching. I'll just jump back into my PowerPoint presentation now, if PowerPoint decides it wants to toe the line. Sometimes it just takes a little second to go into slideshow mode. There you go. All right, is that looking good on the screen? Okay, so since we filmed the video last year, the revegetation works.
Well, we've owned this property for 23 years. It's 80 acres and it's around about a
video running in the background here, so I'll just turn that off so I can concentrate. All right. Good old YouTube comes to the rescue yet again. All right, so since we filmed the video, we've planted 1,400 tube stock along 700 metres of the riverbank. So I think that's a really good result. I'd like to acknowledge the effort of the landholders, the Redriff family, and there's Andrew in the photo there. No, he's not in the photo, he's in the next slide, sorry. So we've got a written agreement detailing the landholders' ongoing maintenance responsibilities to look after the revegetation and fencing, and so far they're doing a great job watering, weeding and checking on plant survival rates. And we've got another video including an interview with him on our LLS YouTube page if you'd like to have a look. Oh, there he is. So we held planting days involving the community and fishing club members and volunteers like Work for the Dole And planting days, I think, are really worthwhile. There's always interesting conversations about wider river management issues and its opportunity to talk about current best practice and riverbank management. And it's a whole other conversation about riparian widths in that video you might have seen. It's not an extensive riparian width we've been able to achieve at this site, but it's all we could negotiate given that it's not a large farm and the floodplain alluvial soils do grow high value feed for the stock. The landholders of the Hunter are very wary about fencing off, in inverted commas, and that's due to perceptions of lost agricultural land, weed management, and the risk of losing fences to floods. But then they also don't like to see their soil eroding or their cattle falling into the river. So I'd suggest for those of you embarking on riparian re-veg projects, try and be a bit flexible and consider, you know, spruiking in particular desirable outcomes for farmers' point of view rather than just the environmental gains. For example, you know, a fenced riparian area can be crash grazed once the vegetation is re-established. I think also it'd be good if we stopped calling it fencing off and considered it another management unit of the farm. So what did we learn from this project? Timber compared with rock provides a cheaper material, a better aquatic habitat, more natural and less permanent. You can see in the photo that the timber is helping the mangroves establish, whereas they'd previously washed away when they were about this size. We've developed a new method of using timber in estuaries and what size of timber is most useful, how to place it and secure it. That's not to say there's not other projects around using timber in estuaries. We're promoting the outcomes to other landholders and river management agencies. We'll be monitoring this site for its stability of the structures, especially following floods. We've had a minor flood over it so far, and we've found that as well as trapping mangrove seeds, it can also be good at trapping thongs and basketballs and other types of floating debris. We don't imagine that the timber will last as long as the rock, but we see that as an advantage because of the in-stream and upper bank vegetation will do the longer term job, hopefully. So the cost, using locally sourced timber can be cheaper and quicker to install than quarried rock. The total cost depends on the scale of your project. In the case of this project, we did over three or four stages. You know, the distance you transport timber can increase your cost of a project. So we capped it at about 100 to 200 kilometres. Seeking your timber sources early, so get to know clearing contractors and local council planning staff. The planning stages of a river rehab project are quite time consuming. All riverine works in New South Wales require an environmental assessment, which is a good thing. So we've prepared a review of environmental factors and consulted Fisheries Local Council, Crown Lands, local Aboriginal lands councils, and the Roads and Maritime Service. We sought funds for this project in stages, which helped to get it underway. And the construction, like I mentioned, has been done over 4 stages. As the timber became available, we didn't have enough timber to start with. And it's unlikely we would have achieved the total budget for this project in one go. So I think, you know, planning it in a staged approach was a good thing. And the funds from this project primarily came from the Hunter catchment contribution, which is a levy charged to Hunter landholders for flood mitigation and catchment improvement works. And we also received a $40,000 New South Wales Fisheries Habitat Action Grant, plus of course the landholders' in-kind contribution for weeding and watering plants. So that's it from me. There's our contact details for myself and my 2 colleagues from Soil Conservation Service. So please feel free to get in touch if you're interested in any more details about this project or anything else we've got going in the Hunter catchment. Thanks for listening.
All right, thanks for that, Jenny.
And thanks for the mid-presentation save, Rhiannon, that was great.
No worries. Does anybody have any questions out there for Jenny? We've got one here from Alice. She said, "You said riparian vegetation, revegetation is a touchy issue with landowners in the Hunter. What did the other surrounding landholders think of your project now that you can show how successful it was?"
That's a really good question. I think, yeah, you win some and you lose some. So if you sort of take on that approach from the beginning, not everyone in your catchment of interest is going to be interested at the very beginning, but I think like you will have one or two or more, hopefully, landholders that are willing to try something new. And, you know, if they become the catchment champion of the new project idea and they're willing to show their neighbours or have field days on their place, it's, you know, it just takes time. But I think once people, for those people who need to see it, to understand it over time, yeah, we're getting more Hunter Estuary landholders interested in revegetation along the riverbank. I think they can see, I mean, this isn't the first, certainly not the first project to do re-veg in the Lower Hunter, and there are some that are sort of 30 and 40 years old, and so you can see along those stretches, I mean, it's aesthetically pleasing and you know, less likely to be actively eroding. So yeah, just showing people I think is one of the best tools.
Excellent, thanks for that, Jenny. I actually cut out halfway through your presentation, so apologies if this question has been answered. Oh, we've also got another one here from Dan. He said, your presentation is very interesting. Wondering if there is an ongoing commitment to monitor the pilot study to quantify improvements in water quality or bank stability. This might help in winning minds. That's a good.
Yeah, it could well do. We were really lucky. Melbourne Uni decided to do some research on rock fillets, and then they incorporated our site using timber into their research as well. And so they've had an initial site visit. This was all pre-COVID, of course. Having a look at, you know, taking measurements over time, amount of sediment accumulation and vegetation success. And we're also monitoring it ourselves with, you know, photo points and plant survival rates and those sorts of things. As far as monitoring water quality, sometimes it's a little bit tricky to determine, you know, your pretty small scale projects contribution to an enormous estuary's water quality, but they do, we do have estuary water quality monitoring in the Lower Hunter. And so hopefully over time, with all our range of riparian re-veg projects, we'll hopefully see improvements. But, you know, down at the bottom of the system, where our water quality is a function of everything that's happening in the entire catchment upstream. So yeah, I guess, you know, it's going to be poor after floods. It's going to be good when there's, you know, moderate inflows or high tides. Yeah, it's pretty variable.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Jenny. And yeah, great example of a project working with, you know, farmers, landholders, community, and trying to get those like environmental benefits at the same time. Okay, we'll move on to Rebecca Mabbott. She's going to talk about her master's research she completed with the Macquarie University. So I'll hand over to her.
Awesome, thanks, Ree. Hopefully you can all see my screen now. So yeah, I did this research for my master's with Macquarie University, and I'm now with the New South Wales Soil Conservation Service alongside Rhiannon. So my project was on geomorphic and vegetative river recovery on the Allen River in the Hunter Valley, and showing the effects of river recovery over time on flow hydrology and the implications for ongoing river management. Okay, hopefully my screen changes. There we go. Yeah, so my case study is the Allen River. So you're getting a large taste of the Hunter Valley today. And I looked at the past of the Allen River. So what does river recovery look like in these systems, and the changes to channel condition since the 1940s. I then looked at the effects of this river recovery on flood behaviour over time, and used quantitative methods of measuring the roughness of riparian vegetation and the effects it's had on flood hydrographs throughout the record, and then made recommendations on how this can inform future river management. So the Allen River is just north of Maitland. It's got a catchment just shy of 400 kilometres squared, a stream length of 90 kilometres. It's a gravel bed stream that is confined in its headwaters and decreases in confinement towards its confluence with the Patterson River. It's a highly modified and degraded system in a lot of places. The valley floor is largely cleared for agricultural land use, and it's undergone a range of river management works throughout the 1900s, including a lot of works as part of the Hunter River training scheme. A lot of these of which I'm sure Soil Con had quite a role in. And you can see an example of that river training works in the bottom left-hand photo, which is at Keys Bridge on the Hunter. So what does river recovery look like? Obviously, it's different for all different types of river types. In these meandering systems, river recovery often looks like a change in geomorphic features from erosive features to depositional features. So before the 1960s, it was very common to see a lot of oversteepened banks, erosive ledges, slumping, and unconsolidated and unvegetated sand and gravel sheets. And then after the 1980s, as recovery really started to accelerate, we saw the reintroduction of benches, vegetated bars, pool and riffle sequences, and the redefinition of that inset or low flow channel. Vegetation recovery looks like an increase in riparian vegetation cover, both aerial cover and density, and the reintroduction of an improved vegetation structure, so that ground, mid and canopy cover. So I looked at the historic aerial photography and compared this to current satellite imagery to quantify the change in riparian vegetation cover and condition over time. And I categorised the vegetation into ground cover only, canopy cover only, and full vegetation cover, where it was dense enough not to be able to see the ground through the canopy. And I was able to see that from 1940 to now, canopy cover increased from only 30% along the riparian corridor of the Allen River to up to 63% now in 2016. But this riparian vegetation cover was a combination of both native and exotic species, and ground truthing revealed that the majority of ground cover and mid-story species were exotic in this riparian zone. Analysis of geomorphic structure throughout the same time period showed that shift from those erosive landforms to those depositional landforms and the contraction of that inset channel. In some places, this accounted for up to 50 metres narrowing of the inset channel and a large increase in geomorphic complexity. To then quantify this increase in vegetation cover over time, I used terrestrial LiDAR and a terrestrial LiDAR gap fraction method to calculate Manning's N. For those of you who've used Manning's N before as a measurement of roughness, you might be familiar with the often quite subjective and qualitative methods used. So often it's you're given examples of photographs of different types of vegetation with pre-assigned Manning's N values, and then it's pretty much a matter of matching what's most similar to your vegetation type in front of you. So it can be quite variable and not very consistent way of measuring roughness. By using this TLS gap fraction method, I was able to measure Manning's N much more accurately and also measure it for different flow stages. So I calculated roughness for low, moderate and major floods on the Allen River, and I was able to show that roughness increased over time by retrospectively applying the average roughness for each of those vegetation categories to the vegetation mapping that I did for those different time slices in the 40s, 60s and 2016. On the bottom left, you can see an example of one of the TLS scans I took. So it provides a 3D point cloud of the vegetation, and I was able to strip out the terrain below it to then just measure the above ground vegetation and its influence. The figure in the middle there, you can see that big jump in roughness between the 1900s and 2016. And on the right, you can see my lovely sequence of very confusing conversions in order to take that three-dimensional point cloud and spit out the Manning's N at the end of it. Each of the different vegetation categories provided very different Manning's N results. So as you would expect, ground cover provided very little roughness, and that's for all stage heights, and didn't increase with stage height. The patchy canopy cover provided more roughness, but it did not increase substantially with increasing flood height, whereas the full vegetation cover increased more substantially for the low flows and even more so for those higher flows as well. And there's an example of each of the different vegetation categories and where those stage heights fall along the bank and the different geomorphic features. You can also see there those bench sequences which played a large role in contracting the Allen River as river recovery took place. I then looked at the changes in flood hydrographs over time to see if this river recovery was actually resulting in a real life result on flood behaviour. I compared floods from before 1990 to after 1990, which is when river recovery really started accelerating due to the introduction of the land care movement and a lot of better land management practices such as fencing off riparian corridors. So I compared floods with similar upstream and downstream flood peaks to try and match them as closely as possible. I was able to show that for a 3-metre flood peak, the travel time increased from 531 minutes to 813 minutes, which is over 4 hours increase in flood travel time. And this decreased flood velocities from 2.66 metres per second to 1.6 metres per second, which is very substantial for the safety of downstream communities and also the resilience of these river systems having those lower flow velocities. But I did see a less significant change in the flood travel times for major flood heights, and this could suggest that more focus needs to be given to improving that riparian vegetation and roughness at that bankfall and overbank stage. And so to inform future river management, I think it's important to acknowledge that self-recovery or passive recovery in river systems can achieve a lot. So despite the Allen River having undergone a lot of intervention in the past as part of the river training schemes, it hasn't actually had a substantial amount of active restoration. It hasn't had large revegetation schemes or anything like that. Most of the recovery has been as a result of fencing off the riparian corridor and allowing it to recover itself. And this has resulted in quite a substantial increase in flood travel times, which is a great result. So it's not always a matter of pouring lots of money into river restoration if the river is resilient enough to do it itself over time. We need to acknowledge that river recovery and revegetation isn't just for the pure environmental benefit. There are also a lot of implications on the safety of downstream communities, and if we can show that there is that decrease in flow velocity, then it gives a much better, it's much more encouraging to push that river recovery for the social benefit as well. and also you don't have these high flow velocities ripping through these systems and causing ongoing damage as well. We also need to acknowledge the role of invasive and exotic species in river recovery. So obviously it's not a matter of going out there and saying, oh, it's okay to have weeds all through these rivers, but we do need to acknowledge that they have provided a large amount of roughness over the last century or longer, which has contributed to a lot of river recovery. And if we go through and start removing these exotic species and managing exotic species, then we need to account for the roughness they are providing and ensure that's replaced with native equivalents so that the geomorphic state of these rivers doesn't start going backwards and we don't see more erosion occurring where exotic species are being removed. And I think that's pretty much mine. Probably a bit quick.
Thanks, Beck. Did anybody have any questions about this study? We've got one that's just come from Jenny. So, would you use the same methods to calculate Manning's N if you were to do the same study again, a similar study?
Yep. Yeah, I would. It took a lot to get to the point of using the TLS for Manning's N. And the reason I settled on that method was purely because it was the least subjective, and it also takes into account all of the roughness there, whereas Manning's N is often quite oversimplified by engineers, and it was developed by engineers to begin with, you know, your concrete channels and a lot of the values that are calculated in those visual guides that you compare to in-field examples. A lot of those are calculated using lab-based flumes and stuff like that, and so they often aren't very accurate when you then take them out into a natural setting like what I did. So a lot of my values some would consider to be quite high, but when you compare them to those people that have calculated Manning's N in very natural settings, they are potentially more accurate. So I would use it again, and also once the method's developed, taking scans with the TLS is super quick and super easy for very accurate results. So yeah, I think the way to go. And also being able to get that flood stage height measurement is quite unique, because often you get a blanket value for the entire stand of vegetation, whereas being able to see that accumulative effect with flood height, I think is very important.
Excellent. We've got a question here from Alice. Are some species considered to be better for bank roughness than others?
Definitely. Yeah, so an example is giant reed, which I've had a lot to do with in the Hunter as well. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, it kind of looks like bamboo. And that's where this method can be a bit not very, I guess, accurate or well informed. If I was to scan a stand of Arundo, giant reed, you'd get a very high Manning's N value for the surface, but because it's got a thick rhizome underground that's quite shallow, when floods do come through, it can often rip up just like a carpet and cause a lot of damage because the whole bank goes with it. So yeah, you definitely have to take into consideration species holding the banks together and how that's going to behave in flood. Similarly, any grass, less sturdy vegetation often fly down in flood and doesn't that roughness, whereas those hardier shrubs and canopy species will withstand floods and provide more roughness. So with those calculations, I was able to input essentially that sturdiness of the vegetation and how likely it was to lay down during flood to then get that Manning's N output. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Beth. So this comes to the conclusion of our webinar. I'll just let you know about some upcoming events that are occurring. Feel free to ask some more questions if you like in the chat there. Let me just share my screen. Apologies. So I'd just like to say thank you to our presenters. It's been really wonderful to have you all join us. And I think the whole aim of the New South Wales Forum that was held in February was to really bring people together. So whether they were research, whether they were from community, whether they were a farmer, it was a really great experience to come together and chat about what we can do on our land, to help landholders, to also learn more from each other. So I think something that I'm really excited about as a New South Wales chapter lead is to bring people together. So if there's something that you would like to organise or run, reach out and let us know, and we'll help you to do that. So I'd also like to just let you know about an exciting event that we have coming up. Because of the COVID restrictions and things that are going on throughout the world, we thought it would be really great to get our river community together for World Rivers Day. So we're organising a River Fest, and it's going to occur throughout a whole day. So we'll have webinar sessions for people to join in on different themes. We'll also have keynote speakers, Ian Rutherford and a few others. We'll have some international presentations as well. And we're going to talk about different themes to do with cultural water, basin scale management, and also the theme of World Rivers Day is waterways in our communities. So we're going to hear from some projects related to that. So we'll be sending out more information about that event. It'll be on the 29th of September, and we'd love for you to join us throughout the day. So I'd just like to say thanks for joining us for our webinar, and hopefully we'll see you soon at an event in the near future.